Hi all, my good friend Natalia Pogonina has recently finished a game versus the rest of the world. It was featured on her website with regular updates. Let's see how, in my view, she strategically crushed the world team. So she kicked off with e4. After c5, she played knight f3, standard stuff, d6, and now the open Sicilian. No side variations here. So mainline stuff. Knight f6, she protects her e-pawn. Now a6. I think this has been the preferred move of players like Kasparov instead of e6 if black's going to play for the Scheveningen. But black might also play e5, and actually e5 was the choice in this game. And one of the problems potentially of e5 is it is potentially, compared to the Scheveningen, has less control over that d5 square. So black does have a strategic responsibility here to make sure that this bishop or some other pieces are guarding d5 so it doesn't become a serious defect in the position and a source of a lack of counterplay, especially if this bishop is, for example, locked in the pawn chain and white's light squared bishop is allowed to remain on the board. So this could become a serious strategic liability. And as we'll see from the game how it evolved, that does appear to be the case from this game. It's the classic Boleslavsky hole which is exploited here. So knight b3, bishop e7, now white castles and black castles. Now there's a very interesting plan here. It looks as though this might be a passive setup, these pieces here, but Natalia's about to sort of manoeuvre her pieces to cover the d5 square. In particular, this is the more passive knight out of these two. She has a very cunning plan coming up to reroute the knight like this to that sensitive d5 square. So rook e1 is the first step in that plan. Now the problem with the world team, it was quite big in this case, and I think the bigger it is, the less strategic it becomes. It more becomes a choice of, oh, let's vote a move, without the deeper strategic considerations which are needed. And it's almost as if they set themselves up for a long-term loss, because thinking from move to move is not good. I mean, it's all right for tactical short-term thinking, but for the structure, for the soul of chess, for d5, considerations, it's also good to think strategically. So bishop e6, now this bishop f3 move is also eyeing systematically that d5 square. So knight bd7. Now there's a potential source of counterplay for black on the c file as compensation. Say like b5, b4, and sometimes, black's arranging some counterplay. But here, Natalia decides to play a4 to try and clamp down on that b5. Although the c4 square is still vulnerable here. So how does Natalia cope with this source of counterplay on the c file while trying to lock down this sensitive d5 square? Well, we'll see. Queen c7. Now this fine manoeuvre, knight d2, comes in. So the knight is heading, as previously mentioned, to this sensitive d5 square. Rook ac8. I mean, it looks logical to do that. What else is black doing? But with the bishop on f3, it's difficult for black to ever liberate with d5 in this position. Liberate the position. So knight f1, knight b6. So eyeing, yes, the c4 square, but in this particular position, is there a tactical liability? Well, sometimes there is a tactical liability created. Say knight c4 takes b2, but the bishop hasn't left home on c1 yet. So by being on c1, it's protecting against the potential for knight takes b2 and queen takes c3 if it can recapture on b2. So Natalia is not too concerned at the moment about knight c4. So she plays knight e3, knight c4 happens, and now the move knight ed5. And it's here some exchanges happen. So knight takes d5, knight takes d5. And look at the strategic responsibility. It's kind of neglected now because black loses that light squared bishop. And I believe this is the beginning of the end now. Even though, there's a potential to reach, maybe opposite coloured bishops. If this knight was exchanged for this, there would be these opposite coloured bishops. But if white maintains a grip on this light square later, this is really leading to a potentially dead position for black. So queen takes d5, knight b6. The queen actually returns here tactically now to b3, so she's combining tactics with strategy. The c2 pawn can't be taken because of the b6 knight, so a very precise, fine move, while keeping control of the liberating move d5 and keeping control of black's counterplay now. So she can further, if she can neutralise this c-file pressure now, then she'll be able to, for example, move this bishop and gang up more on that sensitive d5 square. So knight d7, bishop e3, and the bishop is now prepared to exchange itself off, if necessary, for this knight, leaving this situation of the opposite coloured bishops. If white can dominate the light squares, and eventually maybe even establish a big bishop on d5, that bishop will be emanating its power in all directions. So queen c6, rook ed1, the ganging up starts on d5 again. Now queen takes c2, I think queen takes b7 and white's going to be better. I don't really want to look at detailed variations here. So let's just see now what black does. Well, black defends that b7 pawn. So now Natalia neutralises this c-file pressure. So it's becoming an ideal situation where black's source of counterplay has been squashed and white still maintains an iron grip on that d5 square. So knight c5, and now instead of taking, actually Natalia plays queen c2. She allows that knight to wriggle a bit, so it goes to e6. But now the move a5, clamping down also on the dark squares a bit. So black can't even play b6 without allowing en passant. The knight now goes to g5, and it's here Natalia makes the decision to take off that knight. And some would think, well maybe opposite coloured bishops, that's drawing chances for black. But here the opposite is the case, I believe. If white has already strategic assets, the bishop can accentuate those assets here. This light squared bishop being opposite, and black has no equivalent light squared bishop. We'll see that this is a real problem now for black. So rook a4, queen d7, and now queen b3, eyeing again the d5 square and the whole diagonal, and also b7. So black's pieces are starting to be lower quality than white's. So bishop e2, tactical little threat introduced now, bishop takes a6. Rook c6, defending the a6 pawn. Now rook b4. So this is a very interesting rook manoeuvres as well here being witnessed. So intensifying pressure on b7. Like in a previous Natalia game, where she had the Bolzavsky hole, she actually allowed a pawn to go there and she started attacking light squares. But here it's like the echo is on this side of the board at the moment. So the initial sort of strategic concern was d5, and now it's also b7 clamping down on this poor b7 pawn. So bishop d8, queen a4, rook bc8. So the rooks have really, haven't got a useful c-file here. h3, a quite little waiting move, restricting possibilities. But also, bishop g4 is a nasty skewer to face now for black. So what does black do about it? Well, the team voted queen e7. And now we have this move rook d3. So that provides the flexibility to switch to an attack on the king side. So let's see, the Steinitz rule about accumulating positional advantages is being witnessed here. White is systematically building up more and more pressure on both sides of the board. So first it was d5, then it was b7, and now f7 is being targeted. All of these light squares, which this bishop is hopeless to try and defend. So bishop f6, and now the move queen b3. Again, saying to black, if you take a5, they'll take on b7. And in this case, that would coordinate an attack on f7. And that would be kind of difficult for black to meet. So black actually again meekly defends the b7 pawn. Now we see the move bishop c4. Finally, the bishop steps into the fray. It's going to potentially go to this extremely dominating square, d5. So the move h6 is played. And now the punch has been prepared, so this is the time to start punching. All these pieces are in really good squares. And now usually this would be a weakening move, what Natalia plays next. But here it's a logical extension of the position, g4, because black is not in any position to exploit the weaknesses of this. The advantage of this move, it can sort of tear open lines later with g5 if black's not careful. Black has to keep eyeing the g5 square now, otherwise g5 is an ominous threat. b5. So black is trying to break out a little bit now. But in doing so, some structural damage occurs. This a6 pawn is now vulnerable. And we have an interesting episode now. The rooks come off. Queen a2. This pawn is very vulnerable.